Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pierina Otness and I work with the Department of Health, Environmental Health Directorate, and I'll be talking about asbestos removal and demolition and disposal with respect to public health issues. So here we are in the Environmental Health Directorate out and about at some contaminated sites. So as you can see, the problem associated with asbestos and public health and environmental contamination is quite significant. So there are a number of public health issues associated with asbestos. We know that it's widespread in buildings and structures across WA, so quite prevalent. It is a politically and publicly sensitive material. The expectation that people have once a removal job has been completed is that there is no asbestos containing material remaining at the site. It is controlled by a number of legislative tools, and you've heard about one of those already, the Occupational Safety and Health Regulations, and I know you're probably all very familiar with those. There are a couple of other pieces of legislation you need to be aware of, both the Contaminated Sites Act and the Public Health Regulations, which I will talk about. So a lot of the issues that come up with regard to those regulations is as a result of non-compliances with the occupational safety and health regulations and removal requirements. And these non-compliances can lead to issues associated with on-site contamination, and that comes from poor removal or from inadequate disposal, which we'll talk about. This slide shows the results of an asbestos survey that was conducted with local government across WA, looking at the issues that they face. So looking at the slide, at the graph, almost half the issues they deal with are associated with demolition and removal work. That might be people calling up about how to go about demolition removal of asbestos containing material. It might be complaints about work that is happening. It might be neighbours concerned about demolition and removal work that is happening close to them. In addition, 25% of complaints were associated with dumping, usually illegal dumping. So these are the majority of concerns that are being dealt with or addressed by local government with regard to asbestos. The contributors to contamination with regard to asbestos in the environment are listed on this slide. So one of the important contributors is not identifying building asbestos materials prior to the removal work. That might be because the material hasn't been identified during building inspections, it might not be visible and hasn't ended up on the register. It might be because it's a private residential property and there's no requirement for private residential properties to have inspections or registers. There are some local governments that ask for it to be done prior to demolition, but it doesn't always happen. Poor asbestos removal practices can lead to contamination. So this is from where care is not taken during the removal process and it's not done in compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Code of Practice for Removal. So material is not all removed adequately, or broken as it's removed, or spread as it's removed. Poor removal clean-up practices where materials or structures left behind or soil left behind is not properly cleaned up. Limited site debris checking, which has already been discussed, so making sure that you check the whole site for any fragments or other material that has been left behind. Burial due to soil disturbance at the site, illegal dumping issues, and there may be some issues that are legacy issues, so not associated with removal work but from past use of asbestos, and that might include issues like buried construction waste or historical uncontrolled fill on the site. We've heard already about the occupational safety and health legislation requirements. So the two acts, as I mentioned, I would be talking about today are the Contaminated Sites Act 2003, which is administered by the Department of Environment Regulation, and the Health Asbestos Regulations, which are administered by the Department of Health. Since the Contaminated Sites Act, there's been a large increase in identification of contamination that's come from activities like demolition, removal and illegal waste disposal. This has been because there's been increased infill and redevelopment in both metro and regional locations. So those historical legacy issues are coming up where asbestos materials are being found from previous either infill or construction waste or previous dumping. Those sites are then reported as contaminated under the Contaminated Sites Act and have to go through an onerous process in compliance with the Contaminated Sites Guidelines with regard to investigation, assessment and management. Other sources of contamination are material that's still in use but is deteriorating, and there may be fragments or pieces on the ground that have the potential to be spread and result in soil contamination. These contamination issues present a potential risk to public and a source of community concern and anxiety, definitely, both with finding the contamination in the first place. As I said, it's a very sensitive issue, particularly in WA, where many people know family members or friends who might have contracted an asbestos-related disease. And also with regard to people not really wanting to purchase a property with a memorial on the title where asbestos has been found and managed in situ on the site. Under the Contaminated Sites Act, the sites are required to be reported and classified under the Act. The reporting and classification of a site under the Act, though, can be very easily prevented by making sure that there is compliance with existing occupational safety and health legislation, and that the control measures associated with the removal and clean-up following removal actually happens. So the non-compliance is actually a significant contributor to site classification. Many of the sites we see that have been reported and reviewed by the Department of Health are as a result of non-compliance with removal demolition work. The owner or responsible party needs to take action where a site may be contaminated or reported as contaminated under the Contaminated Sites Act. The kind of action that's required involves really lengthy and expensive investigation and clean-up costs. So you can essentially turn a removal job that costs in the thousands or 10,000s to pretty much leading into the $200, $300, in some cases $600,000 required to decontaminate the soil or manage in situ. A memorial on the title will also remain with restrictions on the use of the site if any asbestos material is left buried at the site, which is not desirable for many developers. The other set of regulations you all need to be aware of are the health asbestos regulations. So under these regulations, the authorised officer in the local government authority, usually the environmental health officer, can administer the requirements under the health asbestos regulations. So the environmental health officer or authorised officer plays an important role in responding to complaints that are received with regard to removal and demolition work, undertaking that initial risk assessment and advising on appropriate actions. Where they feel it's necessary and where there's a non-compliance with the occupational safety and health legislation, they may also alert WorkSafe to what they've seen as part of their original risk assessment. Like WorkSafe, EHOs and Department of Health like to take an advisory, cooperative approach with anybody that they might be discussing or meeting at a site. Obviously asking people to do the right thing or asking about what is happening in order to address the neighbours' complaints if that might be why they've attended. So it's really useful to cooperate with them in these circumstances, give them a copy of the safe work method, show what is happening with regard to control measures that are taken at the site so that they can be assured that the work that is being done in accordance with the Code of Practice for removal. It's important to know what the requirements of the health asbestos regulations are. So these regulations restrict the sale or supply of asbestos-containing material other than for disposal. It also restricts the use of material other than for maintenance or repair, removal for disposal, and you also can't change the position of any asbestos-containing material. So you can't remove or take down a fence and put it in another location. Once it's taken down, it must be disposed of. During the disposal, it requires that asbestos-containing materials be separated from other material and be wrapped in plastic, very much like the occupational health and safety requirements. It is an offence to store, maintain, break, repair, damage, remove, cut, move, dispose or use of asbestos-containing materials without taking reasonable measures to prevent asbestos fibres entering the atmosphere. So this is a requirement of the health asbestos regulations which you all need to be aware of, because preventing asbestos fibres entering the atmosphere is something that can come into play with relation to public health where there aren't appropriate dust control measures at the site. So where there's a release of dust off the site, an environmental health officer will have authority to act under the health asbestos regulations. And this does happen. We had a lot of dry weather in Perth lately, and an environmental health officer investigated a complaint from a removal work where they weren't taking any measures to control dust from the site, and he took a sample from a neighbour 2 doors away from a removal job that was happening and did find asbestos in the dust sample that he took. So just be aware that it's really important to make sure that you're controlling dust at site, to make sure that you're not getting fugitive dust emissions outside of the boundary of the work that you're doing. The reasonable measures that you need to take under the health asbestos regulations are very similar to those that you need to take with regard to occupational safety and health. There are a number of measures that are specifically listed under the regulations, under the health regulations. So that's to use water or other means of controlling dust, using non-powered hand tools, though it does allow powered tools under the same conditions as the Safe Removal Code of Practice, using an approved vacuum or wet cleaning for cleanup, not using any high pressure water or compressed air. The photo that you see on the slide there is following roof cleaning with a high pressure water hose and the contamination that has happened in the surrounding soil as a result of that. Also, no breaking or abrading as far as reasonably practical of asbestos cement sheeting when it's being removed, and disposal in accordance with the environmental protection regulations. So environmental health officers requested the Department of Health do something about the penalties under the health asbestos regulations, because they weren't particularly high penalties and would need the local government to take anybody who was non-compliant to court. So under the current legislative framework that we have, Department of Health looked to increase the penalties as far as we could under the existing legislative framework. So these new penalties have come into place and began on the 24th of January 2017. In addition to new penalties, there's now the ability for the authorised officer in local government to give out an infringement notice, and this is to help deter all these unlawful or non-compliances that are happening and reduce public health risks associated with the mishandling of asbestos materials. Now, this applies to both commercial and non-commercial activities, and it applies to residents doing their own sort of asbestos removal work as well. So the penalty can be up to $10,000 currently, and if the offence continues, an additional daily penalty of up to $1,000 will be applied. Where a local government authorised officer suspects that a person is creating a risk to the public's health through incorrect management and disposal, they do have the power to issue an infringement notice. So non-compliance can lead to referral to a court for hearing or enforcement action. Regardless, prosecution might still be taken where there's a serious threat to public health and safety, where there's a repeat offence, or where there's been reckless disregard of the requirements under the health asbestos regulations. So that might be that they decide the situation is serious enough to go straight to prosecution rather than handing out an infringement notice. When the new Public Health Act 2016 is now in place, under this Act there will be a whole lot of new regulations written, and when those new health asbestos regulations are in place, there'll be an ability to apply even higher penalties. So this will allow for maximum penalties for individuals up to $50,000, for a body corporate up to $200,000, and the daily penalties will increase for an individual up to $10,000 a day, and for a body corporate up to $50,000 a day. And obviously, if it's a commercial operation that's responsible for the non-compliance, they're going to be closer to the higher figure than where the individual is sort of a member of the public. So these new penalties are something to bear in mind. Like has been said by the previous speakers, we don't like to be policemen or regulators. We prefer to work together with removalists and residents to make sure that everybody is using reasonable measures and is dealing with and managing asbestos materials adequately. But where necessary, these penalties can be applied. Building departments also have a role to play within local authorities. They often put conditions on demolition permits that are issued within their local authority area. These kinds of conditions can include the requirement for a hazardous material inspection, which would include inspection for asbestos containing material. They would also, in some cases, point out the requirements with regard to legislation and codes of practice that need to be followed. So they'll highlight that the safe removal code of practice needs to be followed and remind people, particularly residents, of the legislation that's in place where they may not actually be aware of it. They do, in some cases, ask removalists to provide the safe work method, and also in some cases to provide the disposal receipts following the completion of the removal work and the disposal of any asbestos-containing material. So environmental health officers are always a good point of contact, particularly in regional areas when you're doing removal work. It's probably even a good idea to contact them if you're doing any kind of removal work so that they're aware that it's happening in their area. They can advise you on such matters as the health asbestos regulations, other legal requirements that might be in place within that local authority, and what you need to do with regard to those requirements. So what should you do in order to make sure that you're compliant with public health legislation? Anytime that there's any demolition or asbestos removal work at a property, it is really important that no suspect material remains on the site afterwards. So you need to ensure that you comply with all the existing legislative requirements and that you meet the expectations regarding the classification of contaminated sites. So a few fragments left behind is not really meeting the expectations of the clients, of the public, and can potentially lead to somebody questioning whether or not the site has further contamination and needs assessment and investigation under the Contaminated Sites Act. So you don't really want to leave any questions hanging when you leave the site. You need to remove any fragments, any dust or debris in accordance with the legislation and the Safe Removal of Asbestos Code of Practice. You need to keep a record of the details of the removal and disposal. So the location where the removal occurred, the type and quantity of material removed, make sure that that quantity matches the disposal receipt quantity, provide a copy of the disposal receipt, make sure you have procedures and control measures available, and preferably also take photographs of the removal work being done in accordance with legislation. This is really important information to give to your client or to the property owner, as it provides them with sufficient evidence down the track if they want to redevelop the property, or if there are any questions asked with regard to potential contamination. It provides them with the evidence that the work has been done in an adequate manner, and it prevents that need to do lengthy and costly investigation down the track where this information isn't available. If you need further information on soil investigation and cleanup, you can look at our guidelines, which are on our website. Other information is also available on our website, including what to do in case of fire damage and how to clean up following fires and other disasters. And there's also other issues addressed. So please have a look at our public health website and have a look at the information that's available. Here is our contact information, so you can contact the Environmental Health Hazards Unit with regard to any asbestos related issues at the Department of Health. or as I mentioned previously, you can contact the local government authority. And this is the contact for the Department of Environment Regulation, who administer the Contaminated Sites Regulation. Thank you for your time.